So I am in the Libri Prohibiti in Prague with Jiri Nenicka, who is the librarian, chief librarian.
Not a chief librarian. I would say that our chief librarian is the director and founder of the library, Jiří Gruntorád. But yeah, I'm working here with like monographical books, Samizdat ones, but also like printed books of Czechoslovakian exile or secondary literature published after the fall of the communist regime.
Right, and okay. So I guess the gem of your collection, the jewel of your collection is your Samizdat literature. So maybe you could describe to me exactly what that is.
So as you have said, it is the crown jewel of the library, Libri Prohibiti, library of Samizdat and exile books. And we have definitely the largest collection of both Czech and Slovak, or in that time it wouldn't be considered two different separate things, to be considered a Czechoslovakian Samizdat. So that's definitely the biggest collection of these languaged Samizdat in the world. There is also quite a collection of the Polish one. We have some Hungarian ones and very, very little of like it would be in tens of units of Russian ones, and some from the Eastern Germany. And as you have said, what is Samizdat? Well, usually it's an unofficial, or let's say even illegal or underground literature.
Illegal as defined by a repressive communist totalitarian regime.
Yeah, and as you have said, it is good to say the words communist, because like the term samizdat is usually used when we speak about communist regimes. For example, like in the 20th century, nowadays Czech Republic would undergo two totalitarians, one communist one, and before that there was a Nazi occupation. And like the term samizdat usually isn't used for the literature from the 40s under the Nazi rule.
No.
It would be simply called illegal literature. So we could say that the samizdat is still made nowadays because they are still communist countries, though they might be not as repressive as they used to be as in Cuba, but they are, I guess, still as repressive as they used to be in China.
Yes, the Czechoslovakian Samizdat, basically the dates would be 1948 to 89, correct?
Yes, like if we would be speaking about some golden age of Samizdat, we would definitely place it in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
But we could find, let's say, some proto-Samizdat or like Samizdat-like books even from the 50s or 60s. Of course, it wasn't such a phenomenon back then, and very often those are older books. Like it wouldn't be necessarily illegal to publish it, but somebody was doing it for their own pleasure.
Yes, I see, sort of self-publishing.
Yeah, more like self-publishing.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, like the most widely used legend about how the word samizdat came to be is that a Soviet poet Nikolai Glaskov used it as a shortcut for like self-publishing, as an like kind of a joke, because the state publishing house was called Gosizdat in shortcut, and he wouldn't be permitted to publish officially, so he published it himself, wrote it on a typewriter, and then as a kind of a joke wrote on the title page as the publisher Samizdat.
Okay. And it's interesting too, because there's a bit of controversy around the word samizdat, because some Czech writers and people involved in literature, they don't like the fact that samizdat is Russian. The word. You don't know anything about that? Okay. Yeah, I'll cut that. No problem. Okay, so we are then talking about, to define it then, we could say that samizdat is basically a response to the censorship of literary activity.
Yeah, exactly. And as I have said, like in the connection with Nikolai Glaskov, I have said that it was typewritten, his book of poems.
Yes.
And like this, the repression forced people to make the books themselves. That also why self-publishing samizdat. And that means that it could have been done only like by technologies available to them. Like the very first one you could think about is to write something in hand, but that would be very inefficient. So the most common form of samizdat is a book or some loose letters of a paper that were written on a typewriter, because that was the most widely available one.
Yes.
And also like from the very beginning. In the 80s, for example, a very efficient technique was to use copying machine if you had them in your workplace. It wasn't so common in Czechoslovakia back then. Xerox machine. But before that, there were also other technologies available for people, machines that would make more copies than typewriter, called a hectograph. You can probably Google it to see how it looked like. And it used stencils that were still typewritten on the typewriter with the text, and then they would be applied to the machine. These hectographs, they would be again mostly in workplaces, or like some older ones would be also in monasteries or churches, because like as they were meant to produce few hundreds of the copies from a single written page. It was like a technology from the 20s, or maybe from the verge of 19th and 20th century. A quite common thing in Poland. I'm not sure how would they call it in Poland, but in Czechoslovakia it was called a frame, and it was, you could take a frame from a window, or probably a door from the lockers for rabbits, and you would put some fabric on it, and then you could, and using these stencils you could just push the color through this frame, so everybody could manufacture that. And for example, people who were publishing underground or generally samizdat magazines would have them, because you produced a few hundred copies, which is good for a magazine, rather than like having to typewrite the whole magazine on a typewriter, I don't know, several times or several dozen times to get few hundred copies. So that would be quite inefficient. And of course, another technique that was available from the very beginning, but it was very long taking.
Very time consuming.
But very time consuming was photocopying the books using camera. We have books here that were just like you took a photo of hundreds of pages, and then you would develop every single one of it in the black chamber. So it's probably a bit easier than write the book on a typewriter, less time consuming.
Yes.
But then when you like imagine that you will get only one copy when you develop the whole film, maybe it is better to typewrite it.
Yes. Okay.
But it gives some nice bibliophilic, let's say bibliophilic feeling about the book, meaning that how much work must have been spent to manufacture this one single issue.
Well, it just goes to show you how important this was to the people that were producing them. If they're going to spend that much time and effort on it, they really believed that it was important to have this material out circulating.
Yeah, like it doesn't matter which technique we have in mind, but we are speaking about tens or hundreds of hours of work.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a testament to the drive to express yourself.
Yeah, for someone it could be express yourself, and for someone, or this could come in hand, but to express the free thought, which wasn't possible if you would publish it officially.
Yes.
Maybe it might be good for the listeners to mention like the let's say, kinds of, or let's say, groups of people who were publishing samizdat.
Yes.
Because those were also like groups persecuted by the communist regime. So of course you have said expressing yourself. So of course it would be like banned writers. Actually, on the verge of 70s and 80s, there was a compiled dictionary of the banned and unofficial authors, and I believe it had about 400 names in comparison to the dictionary of the official writers, which would be about, I don't know, 250, something like that. And as it was in communist countries, like every profession would have to be in some kind of union. So there was a union for the writers, and if you would be like a living author who was meant to be published, you were part of this union. If not, you had to put your writings in the drawer and wait for better times, or publish them in samizdat, or smuggle them to the free world, to the West, and publish it there, and probably then smuggle these paperbacks or Indian books
back
the
into
West,
the country.
That's actually a case called Samizdat, like like Tam means there, so published there. In
Over
that
there,
place, like,
yes.
Yeah, over there. Yeah.
Yes, I see. Okay. And one example of that is the 68 publishers in Toronto
Yeah.
with Zaretsky.
It was a publishing house started by Josef Škvorecký and his wife, Zdena Salivara Škvorecká, but it should be worth mentioning that she has probably the most credit.
She's the one that really drove the enterprise. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because like Škvorecký was he like published his books there, and they were the, let's say, the better selling part of the books, that they were like making money for the continuance.
So how did that work again? She did a lot of the work on the actual publishing house.
Yeah,
He did his own writing.
Running the publishing house,
Yes.
and he would also like participate on it, but he also had to like teach on the university.
Yes,
and
to
he
make a
was-
living.
Yeah, and he was writing his books, so he couldn't invest that much time as her into the publishing house itself. But like his titles were quite best-selling isn't the word, but
No, they won. One of them won a Governor General's Award in Canada for best work of fiction.
Oh, I'm not surprised, because I personally like his writings. I like the thing I wanted to say was that his titles were like had good sales and would finance the publishing house. For
Yes.
example, one of his novels, I'm not sure about the English translation. In Czech, it's Tankový prapor, so it would be something like tank flag. I'm got like four different editions, because it was so well selling. It is like a lighter story. It is a humorous story from serving in the Czechoslovakian army, like in the mandatory service.
Yeah, that sounds like Good Soldier's Week. That is kind of a theme in Czech literature, is to kind of crap on life in the military, isn't it?
Yeah,
Or officialdom.
well, you might be right, because actually the one of the most copied samizdats, or the one that we have in a lot of copies, considering it's a novel, which is of course harder or longer taking to typewrite than a book of poems, is a book Black Barons by Miroslav Švanderlík, and it's quite similar. Again, it's a comedy or humorous story again, or humorous picture of what it was like to serve in the mandatory service in the special units for for the groups of the population who weren't entrusted with weapons, like their fathers or they themselves would be of bourgeois origin, from bourgeois families, like they would be owners of either factories or even in the countryside of like big parts of the land. Maybe this like returns me to the original thought to let's say point out some of the groups that would publish their works in Samizdat.
Let's first of all, the regime, the communist regime, what did they ban? Like were they concerned about stopping? What were they concerned about that they didn't want the population to read? How is that defined?
So first things that pops up in mind are either novels or books of fact.
Yes, non-fiction.
Either fiction or non-fiction that would like go against the ideology itself. So like the first thing that could pop up in mind is George Orwell with his novel 1984 or Animal Farm, but also like sociological or historical studies that would go against the Marxist-Leninist doctrine.
Anything that would poke fun at it too, I would think, right?
Yeah, of course, mocking, or like a minor thing that pops in mind is pornography, but I don't know, like that was a thing that was also like under censorship during the First Republic, between the First and Second World War, which was a democratic regime. So I guess in America or in Canada in these times also like pornography wouldn't be allowed to be published, or
No, there were some famous legal cases, I think in the early 60s. Lady Chatterley's lover was, and then from that point on it was, you could publish basically whatever you wanted, but that was early 60s.
okay.
But how much of Samizdat was pornography?
I am not aware of any of it. Just as you were speaking about what books would be banned.
Would be banned,
so,
yeah.
But it was like case when you had reviews why the book wouldn't be published or why some author wouldn't be published, that like he is openly speaking about sexuality in his novels and so on.
So was it the case that they had a bunch of readers that had to approve or not approve works? Was that how it worked? So who did that? Was that like a department in the government with a bunch of people that read, and then would they individually say, oh, no, you can't say that? Like, would it be, you know what I'm saying? It's like a lot of it is just personal judgment.
There was, as you have said, special department from, I'm not sure if it was established right in 1948, but during the first 20 years, up to the late 60s, when there was a time of some liberalization and, let's say, democratical tendencies in the Communist Party.
Prague Spring, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was special department which would be roughly translated as like a main management, like press supervision, something like that. Like Department for Press Supervision.
Press would include publishing houses, as well as journals and magazines and such.
And censors would like work there, and this was of course abandoned during the Prague Spring, but later on it was reformed under different title. I'm not sure how it was called back then.
That's right, because the Soviets came in, and then we had this after '68, and we had this period of what they called normalization.
Yeah, like to normalize the, let's say, public and political environment.
Yeah, what the hell does that mean?
Well, in general it meant after not only Soviet but the tanks of all the countries of the Warsaw Pact, which meant the Eastern Bloc, the normalization would meant like returning or establishing again the control from Moscow, and like when you put someone in their place, like investituring, like conservative communists who
I understand,
who would be in compliance with let's say the political flow that Moscow wanted.
I see. So yeah, Moscow very much did have control then.
Yeah, and as you have, as the
They
Prague,
appointed people.
exactly, and
Yeah.
very lately Mikhail Gorbachev died,
Yes.
and back then the secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was Leonid Brezhnev. So he was quite a conservative, oh, we would say conservative communist himself, and like that's the difference when during the Prague Spring one of the countries of the Eastern Bloc like tried to free themselves partly from, or that's probably not the best way to say it, but let's say that one of the countries in the Eastern Bloc, in this case Czechoslovakia, wanted like to have more power or like to reach the socialism and communism their own way.
Right. What was it? A human face?
Yeah, exactly. Communism with a human face.
Yeah.
It was called back then. It wasn't that wasn't acknowledged in Moscow as good, and they wanted
Yes.
to be in charge of the whole communist bloc.
Yeah.
And this happened in 1968, and then we have Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 80s.
Who basically allowed it to happen, the Velvet Revolution, didn't he? I mean, without Gorbachev, it may not have happened.
Yeah, like we could say that he wasn't such a good guy because he was still a communist and he wanted to reform what we think now that was unreformable, or to some people it was probably obvious even back then that like these attempts to reform the regime will meant its downfall. He personally didn't see it, but I believe that like about his personality, even though he was the secretary of the Communist Party and he wanted peace, he wouldn't send tanks to Prague when the Velvet Revolution began.
Yeah.
So like from my part, that's quite good. And he also like wanted for people to like fare better, but he thought it could be done in a communist state, but it appeared it wasn't possible.
Yes.
It collapsed.
Okay. Well, let's get back to there was this Prague Spring, where you sort of were trying to democratize communism or move it towards socialism, let's say, and then it was clamped down on in '68. And then after that really is the sort of golden age of Samizdat, is into the 70s and early 80s. And they used a criteria, this department, to judge what was okay to publish and what was not okay. Who are some of the leaders of the Samizdat movement then? Like, how did it get started in the 70s?
Well, when we speak about Samizdat, we can, of course, many individuals and groups of people were doing that.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of them we will never know because their work will be forever like unidentified in cases of hundreds of books. We will never know who did this exact one. But then
because they were anonymous?
Because they were anonymous, and it would be part of something called like wild Samizdat. Like everybody could copy the book. They would get Samizdat books and then typewrite it themselves in another 10 copies, given the amount of copies you can make on typewriter to be still readable. So let's say 10 or 15 copies on flimsy paper, a lighter paper used especially for these purposes or in offices. And then there were people who were producing Samizdat for the whole 20 or let's say nearly 20 years or 10 years or 5 years. And one of the cases, if you are like asking for some major figure of the Samizdat, would be Ludvík Vaculík, let's say originally journalist or rather editor in magazines, and he like wouldn't during Prague Spring he wrote a famous manifesto and then he wasn't during normalization he couldn't again publish or work in newspapers, so he started his own samizdat, let's say samizdat underground publishing house. Like when we speak of it in Czech, we say samizdatové edice, like samizdat editions.
Yeah.
But like you can exchange the word edition for the underground publishing house. It's probably best to imagine it as an illegal publishing house. And he would had an edition of books. He called it a padlock.
Padlock series, yeah.
Padlock series, or series is probably the better word.
Mm-hmm.
Samizdat series.
And these were these bound?
Yeah, exactly. It's from 1973 when he started with this effort, of this endeavor. He published nearly 400 books.
Did he put his publishing house name on it or not?
There isn't written like a series padlock on it, but there are like shortcuts of either shortcuts or sentences that are like saying there are like people who read it are banned from further copying it, and
yes,
like, which like
that tells you that it's
but that wasn't because they would be keen on copyrights, but and they actually wanted the books to be further copied.
It stopped them from going to prison, though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was, let's say, a technique of survival, though in some cases it wouldn't save them.
What did they publish?
Well, when we speak about edition padlock, it's mostly like novels, books of poems, or like original works of the banned authors. Like this is the hardcore literary samizdat, or there are even some interviews, but mostly it's like original works of the people who couldn't publish officially, so Vaculík knew a lot of them and then get to know more of them. For example, you have interviewed on your podcast Ivan Klima. Vaculík published a lot of his books. I believe actually that the first book that was published in 1973 wasn't actually Vaculík's guinea pigs, but it was Klima's book. But I can't remember what title it was, and I hope I am not saying something incorrect. But
now here's the question: do most of the novels and poems reference censorship, or is it just any kind of literature that covers all sorts of different topics?
Of course, you will read some of these books and you will say, "Oh, I understand why they wouldn't publish it officially."
So, give me an example of that.
Well, we don't have to go far. It could be Vaculík's very own books, because he was like expressing in these novels. They are often quite autobiographic. And for example, the Guinea Pigs, his first novel published in padlock, are, let's say, very, not maybe openly, but more like
I know,
satirically,
subtly,
like they depict the like relationships in the socialist society of the 70s, and like describing what's wrong with it, the relationships in the family of the main hero, and also his workplace, the state bank.
And how silly it is, you mean, and how oppressive?
Oppressive, silly, absurd, we could say.
Yeah, that's a key word, isn't it? Absurd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see.
I enjoy this one very much. Of course, like if I would have to recommend another book from him, it's which English readers can even read. It would be something like Czech Dream Book. In original, it's Český snář. Czech Dream Book, and it's nice because it's actually samizdat about samizdat. It's Vaculík diary entries from the verge of 70s and 80s, or maybe 81.
Okay.
And it is nice because it gives you like the notion what it was like to run the underground publishing house.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Because it's like his diary entries with magical realism isn't the right word, but like they are probably colored a bit apart from reality. And I believe it is a good thing that actually, but that will be only for Czech readers, there is a critical edition being prepared.
Yes,
And the
isn't
full
that
experience.
great? And again, it's Czech Dream Diary. Okay, we'll look it up. It is a novel based on diaries, or it's diaries?
It has a form of diary entries, and his like.
But it's fictional.
Not entirely. It's really his like diary entries, but he's like describing some stories there that probably didn't happen, or they happened otherwise. And because he is speaking or he is describing the writers, for example, who published and were also his friends, there was actually then a compilation of responses of these individuals to the role, how they were portrayed in the Dream Diary.
Okay.
So that was also like controversial because he was exposing facts.
But
about
then
people.
then he could say that it's fiction, though.
Yeah, and
So it protected him.
I really recommend it to read because I think it's a very interesting book. Gives you like nice, good reader experience. You probably learn something about this environment, but then again, it's a question like for a Western reader how much you can like understand the reality described there. But you will see probably.
Well, I don't think that's what you read fiction for, is to understand what different worlds are like.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I would read it, and also it's an example of how things might be in the West. It's not impossible. This type of regime could come into effect.
That's true. For example, I guess that 1984 is still very widely read, and of course, like we haven't yet, or yet in the past, reached like this.
Not in the West, we haven't.
Not in the West.
Yeah.
This kind of totality, but of course, it's a world that might be.
Yes, it's a possibility. More so now than in the last 50 years. Certainly, I think it's a real possibility.
Like it's, as you have said, like it's becoming more possible with all the technologies. Probably, like in the West, we don't feel it as straightforward. For example, as people in China, probably. I really wouldn't like to be in the labor camp or the education camp for Uyghurs in China.
Yeah. Well, even just being living a quote normal life in China. They're surveyed by the state like you wouldn't believe, and they can't. If they say anything, they are brought in for interrogation, and their families are threatened. There's all sorts. It's not a pleasant world, and there's more than 1 billion people are living under that. They're scared. They can't say what they really believe in China. At least that's my understanding. Right now.
Yes, well, there is still samizdat in China, so there are people who want to express themselves freely, but they can't.
So what are some of the lessons that we can learn, for example, to help the Chinese who want to express their thoughts freely? What are some of the lessons that were learned in Czechoslovakia with samizdat that might be able to help?
Well, it's probably a too big question for me.
I mean, what worked? What was, how come it worked so well, or did it work well, or what?
I guess the general things that comes to mind. You must know whom you can trust, with whom you can share specific things. That was.
That's key. Yeah.
That's key, and then again, you can never be sure if the one who you choose to trust isn't part of, in Czechoslovakian circumstances, state security.
That's a good point, isn't it?
To some extent, you have to go with the Orwellian doublethink. You must know to whom reveal, like, your private free thoughts. but I'm not sure like if the level of indoctrination or like the possibilities of the technological spying on people isn't so advanced nowadays. I really cannot imagine what it is like to live under such level of supervision.
That's odd because the Czechs, maybe of the previous generation to yours, they would know exactly what that's like.
Yeah.
But you don't because you were born in the 90s.
Yeah, and
But you would know because, well, you would get a sense because you work in this library here.
like I get the sense, but that's one thing, and like the experience of it, that's something completely different, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what pushes and motivates people to want to be able to say whatever the hell they want to say.
And often go to the jail for it, right?
Yeah. So why is it important to have your library here? Like, what's so important about Samizdat?
Well, I would say that this era of the lack of freedom and considering Samizdat like censorship isn't so far away. It's 30 years, but like still, when we consider, for example, politicians, a lot of them still has some experience or they participated in the communist structures. Doesn't matter if in 70s or just in 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It is a case of our former prime minister, Andrej Babiš. He was a confidant of state security. He was in foreign trade in Morocco, I believe, or some African country, and he would like give information to the state security. But of course now we are like will be having a presidential election in not even half a year. I believe it should be in January or February, and it is still hard to find people. Or there is a new generation of politicians who weren't alive back then or didn't have the chance to meddle with the Communist Party, but one of the candidates who seems quite fine also has like a history of being in a Communist Party, and actually he wanted to be a soldier, and quite recently there were uncovered some documents from him being like part of a program that was preparing like counterintelligence spies.
So he was
like special military
working for the Russians, or
no, like even in like every country has its secret service, and it consists of the people who are like overlooking their country, and then you have those who are like going to other countries and they like get the intelligence and report it back to the country. I'm not sure what is the word for it. Maybe we can
spies?
I wanted to say some more sophisticated word, but spy is probably the best one, and it serves.
Okay. So why is this important then? So why is it important to have this library? In the meantime, though, let's be thinking about that. I should just mention that the Czech leader who led the country to freedom out of the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel, he also had his own imprints, the Samizdat imprint, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He was actually he was having, of course, his works widely copied in Samizdat, and alongside and one of the editions was closely associated with him and his wife, and later his brother. It was in Czech Edice Expedice, so in translation series expedition, and he would publish several hundred titles there. I believe something over 200 titles.
And a lot of them were his own works, but also other stuff too,
but
right?
Also others. In some cases, like the production of these big series would would be the same titles. For example, we would find in Expedition some things that we would find in Watzwick's Padlock.
I see.
But like you reminded me that we have, and now because you asked, we have spoken about 2 of the editions, but there were like tens of them.
How many in total?
From the, I don't know honestly. That's
100?
That's like the thing with Samizdat, that you discover new things every week probably, and you would say, hey, discovering a new title, okay, but even the series, like quite recently we have received a book that was from something we would translate as series Rook, something we never, a rook like the blackbird.
A rook, yeah.
A rook, yeah. And even our director haven't heard about it, and then he like digged into it and got 11 more titles from the person who was actually doing it, but it took some research to like reach these people. So even like the whole series are being discovered.
Yeah, and your director loves doing that too, right? He loves going to all the antiquarian bookstores and searching for stuff.
Yeah, I'm not very well known about this, how he's doing it, but he is visiting several old bookstores, bookshops,
Yeah.
and he gets these samizdat. Or another way how we get a lot of the books is, of course, like from the collections after that people, when someone dies, they.
Yes, right. The estates. Yeah.
Yeah, the estates.
What about the editorial process in the Samizdat? Did anything get published, or was there you had to be chosen by one of these series? They had to decide whether or not they're going to put you in there. It wasn't just anything. There was some sort of gatekeeper, right?
Especially in case of Padlock, or when we speak out Padlock, Watzlik was an old editor, so
yes.
He of course edited the books, and probably would return the manuscripts to, and like point out what could be done better, what could be done otherwise. But then you would have, of course, people who like wouldn't have this experience, so that would be probably a case of the wild samizdat in vast cases, that they would just like overwrite the copy, but wouldn't so much consider themselves with how the book would look like. When we sit in the depository, actually a lot of the books are like professionally book binded. They have professional binding. The general visual impression of samizdat should be just like a typewritten text on loose or paper clipped papers.
Yeah. What percentage are bound versus just papers clipped together? Any idea, like, of what you've got?
Well, of what we've got, I would say like most of them are like when we speak about the series, they are mostly professional binded, because the person who was running this series would knew someone or get to know someone, or in some cases even done the binding themselves.
But like
so
60-70% would be just basically like handing in an essay, right? It wouldn't be necessarily bound. They would just be papers that were clipped together or stapled.
Like, when we consider the books we have here, it's like the majority would be in binding. But then you have like tons of material, like some bulletins or magazines, and then like all the documents of like unofficial organizations, for example Charter 77 or the Committee for Defense of Unjustly Prosecuted, and they would like produce a vast amount of material and documents that wouldn't of course have any binding.
But that would be classified as samizdat.
Not in the literary sense, no. But then again, like in samizdat you wouldn't have just like just literary samizdat.
No.
But for example, there is a lot of let's say religious one, like from Catholics. You would have some samizdat of Boy Scout movement.
That's right, because the communists saw that as competition to their youth movement.
Communist youth, and of course it is not very wise if you want to have like the solid grip on the people in the state to have this, let's say, organization that possess some semi-military, not experience maybe, but skills. Hey, they can survive in woods, and probably, and a lot of the Boy Scouts, of course, have some experience from the resistance against the Nazis.
I see.
During the Second World War.
Yeah.
So a lot of the older ones were actually able to put up a fight if there would be a Third World War, which actually a lot of people believed possible in 1948.
Yeah.
That after very very recently, after the end of the Second World War, we will have the third one, which will be between the West and the communist bloc.
Yeah, that's taken a few years. Then there was the Cold War, of course, but yeah. Okay, so why is it important to have this library?
Well, I would say in general it is important for any developed and cultural society and civilization to have memory institutions, to remember where we come from, and especially in this case it's very recent history, again 30 before it
40 years
before 30 years, and like we are still struggling with it in some sense or in some manners still nowadays. Of course there are like things that weren't uncovered, and also it is important to speak out it because as we have learned after the fall of the communist regimes and end of the Cold War, like this struggle for the free being and for democracy, it's never over, because it can very well slip again into some not totalitarian probably, but authoritarian or semi-authoritarian state if we elect the wrong parties who have easy solutions and offer a strong hand in commanding the population. So I believe it is important to have memory institutions such as ours.
It's documenting the fight for free expression, isn't it?
Yeah, also freedom of thought.
That's pretty important to and also to commemorate the work of these people. These people were heroic.
Yeah.
I mean, what's more important than being able to speak your mind without getting shot?
They cared more about truth and expressing their free thoughts than like losing their freedom in the meaning they would go to jail, or maybe to speak or to give the audience more impression of what it was like during the normalization, like there wouldn't be labor camps and public and not public but like grand political trials and executions as in 50s, but let's say the Communist Party controlled the society, and the society left themselves to be controlled to some extent, to be fair. It wasn't just like you have these people who are, you have the Communist Party, and then you have the people who are doing nothing against, like not necessarily overthrowing it, but at least resisting it.
Yeah, there are lots of people who didn't resist it, they just gave in.
And then you have this, let's say, like minority of people for whom the freedom of thought and to express the truth as they perceive it is important. So let's say this control of the society was carried out by fear from losing your job, fear from losing your home, probably also fear of your children not going to school. This was like quite often that you would be denied like definitely higher education, but in cases also the middle level of the education if you were, let's say, problematic, perceived by the party.
It's like Living in fear. That's China right now. It's living in fear.
I imagine it that way, but I was never there.
No, I mean, I'm just basing this on conversations I've had with people who live in Canada who know what's going on in China right now.
And maybe to some extent, if you, for example, I don't know, I have read some interviews with people who like fled North Korea, and there is so deep indoctrination that they actually believe that the great leader can still see them even though he is far away, and this brainwashing to some extent, you start to question yourself probably, or some fundamental truths are so deeply beaten into your skull that you cannot truly be free of them. I'm not sure. It's quite hard to imagine, but then again, as you have said, that's why we read fiction, to get a notion of what.
Yeah, but you don't have to read fiction to know what it's like.
Not necessarily, in this case, not necessarily.
This is what this library is about, is the fact that it did happen. And this is the result. This is the result of the sort of this freedom sort of seeping through the cracks. And so this is the result of the human desire to tell your own truth.
Yeah, maybe I'm returning to what you asked earlier. Why are we here? Why is this library here? Or why is it important? It just came to my mind that in the 90s, or after the end of the Cold War, like, people also believed, or there was a book by Francis Fukuyama, I believe, The End of History. And we learned that the history hasn't ended.
Oh no.
And
no.
So the history itself, as well as the struggle for like pure democracy, is a non-ending fight, and we must maintain it. We must contribute to it, as well in this multilateral world where there are countries, as in China. We must offer the perspective why we shouldn't follow this model of ruling the society, and that's probably also another reason why to have such institutions, to have proofs and have arguments. Hey, we tried it and we can do it better.
That's great. Thank you for taking the time, and I'll let you do the extra, as I call it. So I've been speaking with
Jiri Nenicka.
And Jiri, what do you do and where are we?
I'm a librarian in library of Samizdat and exile books, Libri Prohibiti.
Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.